Hey, RetconRaider here. It's been a while, so I thought we were about due for another ramble session about Van Buren, the Fallout game that, sadly, we'll never get to play. I mean, sure, there are plenty of fan projects that are trying to recreate the game based on partial and inconsistent design documents, but we'll never know quite what the actual game was supposed to be like. Especially given that despite the large volume of material that did end up being leaked, there are still some pretty huge gaps in what we actually know about Van Buren. That's actually what we're going to talk about today, or at least a very, very small part of it. Today, rather than analyzing one of the leaked design documents, we're going to take a closer look at a chunk of content that we didn't get a design document for. Today, we're going to talk about the Grand Canyon. Or at least the mutant-infested toxic waste dump that it would have appeared as in Fallout Van Buren. Oh, but before we do, I should probably take a quick moment to thank the Raiders, the fine folks who help make these videos possible. Nine Knives, Revenant, Alois, Anerdinwarpaint, Dragon Matrix 7, Exsellsior, Gottlieb, Kazorm, Lima, Nathan Welch Jr., Tomasz Piątkowski, Triphoppenskip, and Valinrook. Thanks for your support, guys. That said, let's get started. Now, despite never receiving an official design document, the Grand Canyon is rather unusual in that we still have a fairly substantial amount of information about what the developers had planned for it. There's a piece of leaked concept art, a handful of references in the other leaked documents, and a small amount of information gleaned from developer interviews. But by far, the most substantial amount of information came from material that was data mined from the original Van Buren tech demo. Rather inexplicably, the original tech demo included fragments of work-in-progress material planned for several locations in the main campaign. It provides us with invaluable insight into what sort of content this location was intended to encompass, the characters, the quests, and even some of the threats that the player would end up having to contend with while trying to explore and potentially plunder the secrets of the canyon. Sadly, there's not a lot of structure to the data. It's just sort of all over the place, but let's start with the basics. Just like in the real world, the Grand Canyon in Van Buren measured roughly 277 miles long, 18 miles wide, and 1 mile deep at its deepest point. Grand Canyon National Park was also established in 1919, again matching its real-world counterpart. This information could be verified by speaking with Torbot Model 01B, which the player could encounter at an old abandoned ranger station. Unlike the real Grand Canyon, however, the Grand Canyon in Van Buren showed more signs of being overtly commercialized. For example, an aerial tram had been constructed for tourists, easing travel between the northern and southern rim. This is something which has occasionally been proposed in real life, but which has steadfastly been refused by the tribes which consider the region sacred. Things would diverge even further as global tensions rose, with the US government eventually closing the park and lifting its protected status in 2057. With a potential nuclear conflict looming on the horizon, the government opened the door for hasty and destructive uranium mining, leaving the canyon walls pitted with dangerous uranium mines, and the floor of the canyon strewn with broken equipment and a veritable ocean of toxic waste. In the decades after the Great War, the canyon would become a tempting target for scavengers, albeit a very dangerous one. The toxic waste made the canyon floor into a radioactive hellscape and a breeding ground for all manner of dangerous mutant creatures. It was essentially the birthplace of Caesar's Legion, as described in the cut New Canaan design document. Joshua Graham, also known as the Hanged Man, first encountered the future Caesar at the canyon's edge in 2238. He would go on to become Caesar's first legate, only to eventually be covered in pitch, lit ablaze, and hurled into the canyon as punishment, after the Legion's first disastrous attempt to conquer Hoover Dam. Don't worry, he got better. Well, technically he got worse, but that's really a subject for another video. Finally, sometime between the year 2200 and 2252, just before the beginning of Van Buren, Bomb 2, an American nuclear weapons platform, was struck by an unidentified asteroid and knocked out of orbit. This, of course, was the sister satellite to Bomb 1, still in orbit, and the unfinished Bomb 3, which the player could discover at Bloomfield Space Center. Parts of Bomb 2 were scattered all along the Grand Canyon, with the main computer core ending up somewhere along the western stretch of canyon floor. This, of course, is what would ultimately end up bringing the player out to the Grand Canyon, though the player could, of course, end up visiting this location much earlier in the game if they chose to do so. As established back in our final video about the Bloomfield Space Center, the player would need this computer core to actually complete the game. It contained the coordinates to Bomb 1, which the player would need to set the flight path on the Hermes 13 space shuttle. This would have required the player to find their way down to the floor of the canyon, to navigate their way through an old uranium mine, and to contend with traps, mutated creatures, and a trio of Victor Presper's most elite killers. Now, according to some rather intriguing information collected by Auser, the founder of the original Fallout Wiki, the Grand Canyon was going to be broken up into roughly 5 main locations: the North Lodge, the South Campsite, the canyon floor, the old uranium mine, and the Bomb 2 crash site. Let's tackle these one at a time. First up, we've got the North Lodge and South Campsite, which, from what I've gathered, were essentially 2 sides to the same general location, separated of course by the canyon itself. I'm assuming that each would have featured its own exit grid, with the player's initial placement being determined by which side of the canyon they were standing on when they entered the world map. Both sublocations would technically be connected by the aforementioned aerial tramway, but that would be non-functional when the player first arrived, stripped for parts by a passing group of scavengers. Restoring the tramway was one of the quests that the player could tackle in this location, but it doesn't appear to have been an actual integral part of the main quest to reach the Bomb 2 crash site. The North Lodge was also the base of operations for Santiago Salvagers, a group of elderly scavengers led by a man named Santiago. Santiago served as both a potential trader and a source of valuable information about the area. He could warn the player about potential hazards, provide information about the broken tramway, and even hint at where the player could find the Bomb 2 crash site. He was also involved in a short series of side quests focused on restoring the broken tramway. If the player asked about it, Santiago would explain that a different group of scavengers had stripped the tramway for parts some time ago, and he could be convinced to track down those traders and recover the parts for the player. It would require Santiago some time to actually do this, but once he did, the player would then be able to use them to repair the broken tram, effectively opening a shortcut that would allow them to quickly cross from the North Lodge to the southern camp. Aside from simply being convenient, this would also play into the game's overarching trade route system. Repairing the tram would allow the player, with Santiago's help, to establish a toll crossing for other caravans. The player would then be able to periodically visit Santiago to claim their share of the collected tolls. It's also possible that this would have presumably presented the player with a more direct benefit if they had established their own trade routes, especially if they had restored or otherwise claimed the Bloomfield Space Center. One thing we do know, however, is that if the player actually repaired the tram, it would eventually be hijacked by a group of thugs sent by the Crimson Caravan Company, a shady trade group based out of the nearby Hoover Dam. They would easily intimidate Santiago Salvagers into giving it up without a fight, leaving the player to deal with it the next time they came by. If the player wanted to reclaim the tram, then they would either need to trick or intimidate the thugs into leaving, or they would need to kill them. If the player opted for violence, then Santiago Salvagers would try to back them up, though it would very quickly become evident that the old scavengers were fairly inept at combat, thus thoroughly illustrating why they had surrendered the tram so easily in the first place. Regardless, once the Crimson Caravan thugs had been dealt with, and assuming that Santiago Salvagers actually survived the confrontation, players with appropriate combat skills would then be able to teach the old scavengers how to fight more effectively. This would presumably help secure the tramway for the rest of the game, and it may be safe to assume that if the player skipped this step, then it would inevitably lead to negative consequences later down the line. Now, turning our attention to the south campsite, we don't actually know a lot about this sublocation, aside from that it was on the canyon's south rim and it was linked to the North Lodge via the broken tramway. One thing we do know about it, however, again thanks to Author of the old Fallout Wiki, is that this is where the player would have discovered the portable science lab. This trailer was intended to be the ultimate science boy accessory, a portable high-end lab that the player could hook up to the back of their vehicle and use to do advanced science crafting out on the road. It's possible that this is also where the abandoned ranger station was supposed to be located. I can't say that for certain since the ranger station is oddly absent on the key features outline shared by one of the devs. It's only thanks to the data-mined dialogue and Pip-Boy entries that we know about it at all, because this is where the player would have encountered the still-functional Torbot Model 01B. Looking into it though, there are two main park ranger stations in the real Grand Canyon National Park, Phantom Station on the North Rim and Indian Garden Station on the South Rim. It seems likely that the abandoned ranger station in Van Buren would be inspired or based on one of those, and given that it's specifically mentioned as being abandoned, it seems likely it wouldn't be on the north side, where Santiago salvagers were staying. Either way, this would be another location where the player could acquire potential loot or information. The still-functional Torbot would initially mistake the player for a visitor, providing basic information about the canyon's history and warning that the park was indefinitely closed. The player could also learn that the robot contained a sealed lost and found compartment, containing potentially valuable items that it had found while guarding the area over the past 2 centuries. The easiest way to obtain these goods would be to simply destroy the Torbot, which would have the presumed benefit of also then allowing tech-oriented players to strip it for parts, though it's possible that this was intended to be balanced out by inadvertently damaging or destroying items inside the lost and found. A slightly more roundabout and potentially safer means of gaining access to the compartment was to instead locate an old park ranger uniform, which the player could then wear to trick the robot into believing they had proper authorization. Now, it's unclear on exactly how the player would descend into the actual canyon itself, but the canyon floor was clearly intended to be a late-game threat. Environmental hazards included high levels of radiation, extreme heat, and a metaphorical ocean of toxic waste. Santiago would recommend taking large amounts of Rad-X and Radaway, and warn against wearing anything heavier than leather armor to avoid heat exhaustion, likely an extension of the game's planned fatigue mechanic. The canyon floor would also be infested with all manner of radiation-spawned mutants. Santiago would warn the player about more common creatures such as mutant bees, mutant lizards, and rad scorpions, but leaked concept art also revealed a more unique threat: fearsome mutant cannibals. The very sparse information available implies that these creatures were once human, but were mutated to now stand 5 feet tall with oversized craniums, sharp teeth, and long, clawed fingers. It's also possible that another intended hazard along the canyon floor were old traps. One of the encounters planned for the Grand Canyon was with a ghoul scavenger named Ike, whom the player would encounter standing on top of an active landmine. Ike would plead for help, explaining that he'd been standing on the mine's pressure plate for about 3 weeks, and that the second he stepped off, it would detonate. The interactions with Ike were fairly straightforward. The player could ignore him, try to help him, or even just kill him and loot his corpse. If the player chose to help him, they could do so out of the kindness of their heart, and for a little extra karma, or they could strong-arm Ike into handing over all the loot he had secured before stepping on the mine. As for the attached uranium mine, we know that the player would have been required to navigate through this sublocation to circumvent the ocean of toxic waste that was cutting them off from Bomb 2. The player would need to reactivate old mining equipment to help clear a path, though sadly we just don't have any real details about that. The mine would also, of course, be a valuable and incredibly dangerous source of raw uranium. This would actually tie into an optional late-game quest out at the reservation. If Measles or the player ended up reporting the presence of the uranium mine back to Dr. Willem Clark, then Clark would express interest in constructing a railway between the 2 locations, so his men could start mining additional uranium to further enable his plot. The player could likely net some rewards by assisting in this effort, but doing so would also tacitly support Clark's mad plan to essentially irradiate the entire region and render it inhospitable to non-ghoul life. Given that the game was going to include an overarching trade route system, it's likely that there would have been safer people for the player to trade uranium with. Aside from the uranium, both the canyon floor and the mine would likely be an invaluable source of high-end salvage, left behind by mining teams and unlucky scavengers. It is likely where the player was intended to discover another quest item, the Agricola Fire Suppression Module, which was required to extinguish the subterranean coal fires in Burham Springs. That was a quest that the player could acquire from Governor Dodge, the leader of the settlement at Hoover Dam, or which the player could simply embark upon of their own volition. Assuming the player could successfully navigate their way across the canyon floor and through the old uranium mine, they would finally be able to access the remains of Bomb 2 and recover its still functional computer core. Unfortunately, there would be one last obstacle that they would need to overcome before they could actually leave the area. By this point in the story, Dr. Victor Presper would have noticed that the player seemed to be dogging his steps, and would now identify them as a potential threat. The player would be confronted by 3 of Victor Presper's deadliest soldiers: Captain Davidson, Captain Pierce, and Major Robert Briggs. These are NPCs that we actually know a fair bit about, because all 3 of them have full write-ups in the Bomb 1 document. It clearly indicates that unless the player kills them during the forced encounter in the Grand Canyon, they'll be encountered again on Bomb 1, where they'll back up General Coleridge during what is essentially the final boss fight of the game. During the confrontation in the Grand Canyon, Pierce would act as the squad's spokesman, calling the player out and explaining that they were a potential threat that Presper had ordered the soldiers to deal with. This would give the player a brief window of opportunity, which they could use to convince Pierce that they actually wanted to help Presper with his plot. If the bluff or persuasion check succeeded, then Pierce and the others would walk away, but they would still presumably turn up on Bomb 1 during the final confrontation with Presper. Slightly more peculiar, the player could also end up convincing Pierce that Presper was just using the soldiers, and fully intended to dispose of them once his plan was complete. In that case, Pierce would not only agree to let the player go, but he would also be willing to tell the player that Presper was heading for Bloomfield Space Center, though the implication is that Presper would already be long gone by the time the player actually got there. In this scenario, it seems less likely that Pierce would end up traveling to Bomb 1, though it's possible that Briggs still would, and it's almost certain that Davidson still would. It's also interesting to note that while Briggs and Davidson couldn't be encountered before the Grand Canyon, Pierce actually could be encountered as far back as Boulder Dome in Act 1. There, he and several of his men would confront the player in the dome's parking garage, attempting to cow the player into surrendering. Although it's not spelled out in the documents, it's possible that if the player killed Pierce all the way back in Boulder Dome, then this scenario would end up playing out completely differently. Pierce normally acted as the spokesman for the hit squad, but with him out of the picture, that would theoretically leave the player contending with Briggs or Davidson instead. Briggs is described as having a guilty conscience, possibly for the role he played in effectively destroying Burham Springs, so perhaps the player would have been able to negotiate with him. Davidson, on the other hand, is described as a fanatically loyal super soldier, basically a perfect weapon designed only for killing, so trying to negotiate with him would almost certainly be doomed to fail. Of the 3 soldiers, Captain Davidson was definitely the most prominent threat. While Pierce and Briggs were well armed and fairly skilled, they were only rated as level 12 threats, putting them roughly on par with most of the mid-game challenges. Davidson, on the other hand, was listed as a level 25 opponent, making him one of the most powerful enemies in the entire game. Regardless of how things played out, once the player had dealt with Pierce and his men, they could secure the computer core, and they would be one step closer to prepping the Hermes 13 for flight. While this wasn't necessarily the most complicated step they would have to complete in order to reach the game's planned finale, it was certainly one of the most daunting. The player's interactions with Pierce and the others would also have a direct impact on how that final confrontation with Victor Presper would end up playing out. But that, of course, is the subject of another video. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, while I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out the design documents for yourself by visiting the fan-run Fallout Wiki. And if you'd like to help support the channel, then feel free to push the buttons that do the things, or maybe even check out the Patreon. As always, links are in the description.